made it to week 11 of the fantasy football season. That means the fantasy playoffs are just around the corner. We've got 4 teams on bye this week and a host of injuries. So I got to bring in the expert, SI senior fantasy analyst, Michael Fabiano, to help us set the best lineups for this weekend. Okay, Fabs. Wow, it's been brutal this week, but I know you're going to help us out. Let's start at the quarterback position. We know that we're without, a lot of people. Matt Stafford's been injured, Kyler Murray's been injured, but you say there's a few people we can count on, one of which may be even available on the waiver wire.
Yeah, let's start off with Dak Prescott, though. Certainly not going to be available on the wire, but a guy who, even though the Cowboys lost last week, which I'm still kind of not over, he had over 19 fantasy points. And he's got a really good matchup this week against the Vikings. Their defense has allowed 17 plus fantasy points to 5 quarterbacks, including 3 who have gone over 19. This should be a high scoring game. Start Dak Prescott, and the quarterback you mentioned who could be on the waiver wire, Daniel Jones. Like, I get it. He's inconsistent, okay? But the Giants are winning games, surprisingly or not, and he has scored 18 plus points in 2 of his last 3 games. He's got the Lions coming up next. They've allowed 6 quarterbacks to score more than 18 points, including 5 with more than 24 and 2 who've gone over 31. So this is a really good spot for Daniel Jones.
Yeah, it's hard to believe, but the Giants are actually in second place in the NFC East. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. Let's talk about quarterbacks. We're going to sit, again, another waiver wire ad, and someone whose team just can't seem to win, and he even got emotional about it this week, and you say doesn't look positive for him to put up a lot of stats this week for you either.
And that's Derek Carr, and I'm a fan of him as a person and as a quarterback. He's actually had a couple of good games in a row, 18 plus points in 2 straight games, but look at his numbers historically against Denver. They're terrible. He is averaging 12.5 fantasy points in 16 career games against Denver. So you want to fade him. There's not a lot of Raiders to like this week outside of Devontae Adams and Josh Jacobs. And then Matt Ryan, who had a very good game last week. He was a top 5 fantasy quarterback. Thank you, Jeff Saturday, by the way, for bringing him back. But I don't love the matchup against the Eagles. No team in the league has allowed fewer fantasy points to quarterbacks. So maybe you can pick up Matt Ryan. I'm not playing him in traditional 1 quarterback leagues.
I'm going to echo that. Thank you, Jeff Saturday, because Jonathan Taylor finally had the day I've been waiting for all season long. All right, speaking of running backs, Baker Mayfield's supposed to be taking over this week, but you say stay the course with D'Onta Foreman because he's been a stud.
All Baker has to do is hand the ball off to him. I mean, can he mess that up? I mean, maybe he can. I'm not sure. But yeah. Foreman's been great. I mean, look at his numbers. He's had 1 really bad game over the last month or so. You play the Ravens. 3 running backs have beaten them for 14 plus points in 3 of their last 4 games. So you think Ravens and you think good defense, but running backs can have success against them. And speaking of a team that running backs have success against, how about the Houston Texans? I mean, every single week, there's a running back absolutely boat racing this team. And next up, they have the Washington Commanders. So I'm going to play Antonio Gibson, and you can also play Brian Robinson this week as well. The Texans have allowed 15 plus fantasy points to 7 running backs, including 5 who've gone over 27 and 4, Jen, who've gone over 30. I mean, it's insane. It's like Christmas Day for running backs when you play the Texans. So play Antonio Gibson, and as I mentioned, Brian Robinson is also a flex.
The Houston Texans are like a cheat code for player props too. Basically, every week I just go in and I'm like, okay, what's the player prop for the running back facing the Texans? I take that over and it's like, it's free money. It's just free money at SI Sportsbook. So check that out. All right, as far as who we're sitting at the running back position, Najee Harris had his best game of the season last week, but you say we can't quite trust it.
I'm going with the 2 running backs I said to sit last week. One I was right about. Najee Harris scored 9 points. And he was actually really good. Like, his rushing totals were very good. He does not get utilized as a pass catcher anymore, though. And he was a guy who caught over 70 balls last year. He's not even on pace for 50 this year. And the matchup's not great against Cincinnati. And then James Conner, hey, I was dead wrong about him last week. He had a couple of touchdowns. But when Matt Stafford wasn't playing, I think that changed the dynamic of the game. And, of course, Kyler Murray not being in there as well. If Kyler's able to come back this week, I think Conner sees less of a role, and the Niners are really good against running backs. In fact, no running back, aside from Christian McCaffrey when he played for the Panthers, has scored more than 16.5 fantasy points against San Francisco, and they've allowed the second fewest points. So, Jen, this is more of a beware than a hard sit.
Right.
Just temper your expectations for James Conner.
Yeah, he could easily just get a goal line carry and end up being okay. But I absolutely, I'm with you. And going back to Najee Harris, you're right. He's not catching anymore. But just as a note, Jaylen Warren could be available on a lot of waiver wires. And he is the running back that's getting those receptions. And now that Chase Claypool's gone, he could be someone you want to put your waiver wire claims in for. Okay, moving over to wide receivers. Rondale Moore looked good even with Colt McCoy. And you say go ahead and fire him up this weekend.
And the last couple of matchups on paper have not been good for Rondale Moore, but he has been very good. 14 plus points in 3 straight games, 31 targets in that time. And now there's no Zach Ertz. And we know Hollywood Brown is close to coming back, but I don't know that he'll be back this week for that game in Mexico. Then you factor in the Niners. Their defense is very good, but they've given up the second most points to slot receivers, which is where Moore has run about 55% of his routes. So I think he is in the wide receiver 2 flex conversation. And so is Darnell Mooney. Now I get it. His numbers have been a bit uneven this year. He's hard to trust, but he's got Atlanta this week. I mean, their defense has given up the most fantasy points to wide receivers, the second most points to perimeter receivers. Justin Fields is the hottest quarterback, not only in the NFL, but on the planet right now. So Darnell Mooney is a very good play this week.
Oh my God, Justin Fields is going to have another field day, unintended, on Sunday. He can't win a game for his team quite yet, but he's certainly winning games for me, his fantasy manager. Thank you so much, Justin Fields, especially since you were a waiver wire ad. Oh, just love it. Okay, let's talk about who we're going to sit at wide receiver. You talked about sitting Matt Ryan. You're also sitting Michael Pittman.
Pittman's more of a beware. Now, I told you to sit him last week. He didn't have a great game. It was Paris Campbell who had a big game, and of course, Jonathan Taylor. And anytime a wide receiver who's not an elite type guy is facing Darius Slay, you got to be concerned. Now, Terry McLaurin did have a good game on Monday night, so I will say that. But overall, the Eagles have been tough against perimeter receivers. So you could start Pittman, but temper your expectations in that game. And then Drake London, he had a good game. Finally, it was the first time he had scored double-digit points since week 3. But now he's got the Bears. And you may not think of the Bears as this great defense, and I'm not saying that they are, but this unit has surrendered just 2 touchdowns and the second fewest fantasy points to perimeter receivers. So I think Drake London is a risk this weekend.
You're spot on about the Bears. The way to get to the Bears is actually you can target running backs versus the Bears, but you're right. Receivers haven't done well versus the Bears at all, fantasy-wise. All right, tight end. This is a brutal position right now. We've lost Zach Ertz and Dallas Goedert, making it even more thin than ever before. So we need your help here, big time, Fabs. Who can we start? Who can we trust?
Let's start off with Dalton Schultz. He is back to his 2021 form. His pal Dak Prescott is back. The last 2 games, 30.8 fantasy points. Gotta love it. This week he's got the Vikings. They've allowed the 9th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Schultz will be involved. Get him into your lineups. And then Greg Dulcich. I was wrong about him last week. Hey, when I'm wrong, I will absolutely admit it. He had a stinker last week. But now he's got the Raiders. And their defense is just not very good against tight ends. They've given up at least 9.7 fantasy points to 6 tight ends, including Jeff Swaim, Jordan Akins, and Kylen Granson. Those guys are not elite players in fantasy football, so I think Dulcich is still a top 10 play this week against Las Vegas.
Now here's what's interesting. I'm looking at your sit list here, and even with the thin tight end position, you've got 2 guys that were drafted to be studs. They, one of them, it makes no sense. The other one was a major force at tight end last year. You say they can't be trusted.
Kyle Pitts is on this list, and Jen, people probably have to play him. Like, I get it. It's kind of like Najee Harris. Like, you kind of have to play him, but you don't have to like it. He had a bad game last week, 4.8 points against the Panthers. Now he's got the Bears. They've allowed fewer than 9 points per game to tight ends, and just 2 players at the position have scored more than 8.2 fantasy points against Chicago. So Pitts is a risk, and so is Dawson Knox. Understand, he is a startable asset in fantasy. With all the injuries, you may have to go out and start him. I totally understand that. But the Browns have been very tough on tight ends. Just 1 player at that position has scored more than 10 fantasy points against them all season long. So if you start Knox, temper your expectations. I think we're going to say a lot of that this week at tight end because there are just so many injuries across the league.
Yep, I agree. Thank you so much, Fabs. Your advice is excellent as always. And to all of you out there, for an entire list of start and sits at each position, be sure you check out SI.com. They will be updated on a daily basis with Michael Fabiano's rankings because news is coming hot and heavy. There are lots of injuries, lots of things to look out for. So be sure you check out the most updated list at SI.com and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.